Silence is more dangerous than any argument you could ever win, and the people who thrive on chaos know this better than anyone else, even if they never admit it out loud. The real shift does not begin when you finally say the perfect words or prove your point. It begins in the exact moment you decide to stop reacting altogether. What if the strongest move is not speaking louder, not defending harder, not explaining yourself again and again, but stepping back so completely that the entire game collapses on its own? No arguing, no explaining, no defending yourself. And somehow, without force, without effort, they begin to lose their power piece by piece. This is not weakness, and it is not avoidance. It is a quiet form of control that most people never learn because they are too busy trying to win fights that were designed to drain them from the very beginning. There is a hidden pattern behind toxic behavior that few people talk about in simple terms. Toxic people do not operate on logic the way normal conversations do. They operate on emotional reaction, and every reaction you give them becomes a kind of fuel that keeps the cycle alive. The louder you get, the more energy you show, the more attention you give, the stronger they feel. It is not about the topic. It is not about being right or wrong. It is about keeping you engaged, keeping you pulled in, keeping you responding. That is why so many situations repeat themselves over and over again with different words but the same exhausting result. You leave the conversation feeling drained, confused, and somehow responsible, while they walk away unchanged, already preparing for the next round. This is not random behavior, it is a pattern, and once you see it clearly, everything starts to make sense in a way that completely changes how you respond. Most advice tells you to stand up, to speak clearly, to set boundaries loudly, to explain your side until the other person finally understands. That sounds strong on the surface, but in many cases it quietly keeps you trapped. Because toxic people are not looking for clarity, they are looking for engagement. They want you to explain, to react, to defend, because every word you give them gives them another opening to twist, redirect, or escalate. This is where most people get stuck without realizing it. They think they are solving the problem, but they are actually feeding it. And the more they try, the more complicated it becomes. The cycle grows stronger not because of weakness, but because of effort in the wrong direction. What you are about to learn in this video is a completely different approach. One that does not rely on confrontation, does not depend on perfect communication, and does not require you to change the other person at all. Instead, it focuses on something far more powerful and far more under your control. You will learn how to remove the very thing that toxic behavior depends on: your reaction, your emotional energy, your attention. You will understand why silence can be more effective than the best argument, why emotional detachment creates confusion on the other side, and why consistency in this approach slowly forces toxic people to lose interest without any direct conflict. This is not about ignoring everything or pretending nothing matters. It is about choosing where your energy goes and where it stops completely. There are lesser-known psychological dynamics behind this that are rarely explained in simple language. Human behavior, especially negative behavior, often depends on reinforcement. When a reaction is rewarded, even indirectly, it tends to repeat. This applies to everyday habits, and it also applies to toxic interactions. If someone provokes you and gets a strong emotional response, that response becomes a reward, even if it looks negative on the surface. Over time, this creates a loop where the behavior continues because it works. But when the reward disappears, when the reaction is no longer there, the behavior starts to weaken. At first, it may intensify because the person is trying to regain control, but without reinforcement, it cannot sustain itself forever. This is where the shift begins, and this is where most people give up too early because they expect instant results instead of understanding the process. There have been many real-life situations, both in personal relationships and professional environments, where this quiet shift has completely changed the outcome without a single dramatic confrontation. In workplaces, individuals who stopped engaging in unnecessary conflict often noticed that certain difficult colleagues simply lost interest over time. In personal relationships, stepping back from constant emotional responses has led to a noticeable decrease in manipulation and pressure. These are not dramatic moments that get attention, they are subtle changes that happen gradually, but their impact is deep and long-lasting. The common factor in all these situations is not strength through words, but strength through restraint. As this video continues, you will start to see how small changes in behavior create large shifts in dynamics. You will see how becoming less reactive does not make you weaker, it actually makes you less accessible to manipulation. You will understand how silence, when used correctly, is not empty. It is a clear signal that the usual patterns no longer work. And most importantly, you will learn how to apply this in a consistent way so that it becomes natural, not forced. Because the real power in this approach is not in a single moment, it is in repetition, in staying calm even when the other person tries harder, in not falling back into old patterns just because the pressure increases for a short time. There is also a deeper layer to this that goes beyond just dealing with toxic people. It changes how you see control, how you see communication, and how you protect your own mental space. Many people spend years trying to fix others, trying to be understood, trying to reach a point where everything finally makes sense. But sometimes the real solution is not in fixing the situation, it is in stepping out of it in a way that removes its impact on you. That is where real peace starts to appear. Not because everything around you is perfect, but because you are no longer participating in what drains you. Stay with this video until the end because each part builds on the next and the full picture only becomes clear when you see how all these pieces connect. What starts as a simple idea about silence turns into a complete shift in how you handle difficult people, difficult conversations, and even your own reactions. By the end, the approach will feel simple but also powerful in a way that is easy to apply in real life without creating more conflict or stress. Welcome to our channel, a place where simple ideas are explored in a deeper way so you can understand what truly works and what quietly keeps you stuck. If this kind of insight speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe, because every video here is designed to help you move with more clarity, more control, and far less unnecessary struggle. Everything most people believe about handling toxic behavior sounds strong on the surface, but in reality, it often keeps the cycle alive in a way that is hard to notice in the moment. You've been told to fight back, to speak up, to defend yourself clearly and confidently, to set boundaries in a loud and visible way so the other person finally understands where you stand. You've been told that silence is weakness, that not responding means losing, that if you don't explain yourself, then the other person wins by default. These ideas feel logical, they feel empowering, and in normal situations they can work. But toxic interactions do not follow normal rules, and that is exactly where most people get trapped without realizing it. Because what looks like strength in a healthy conversation can become a source of fuel in a toxic one. Every time you respond with emotion, every time you try to explain, every time you try to correct them or prove your point, you are giving them something they can use to keep the interaction going. And the more effort you put in, the more material they have to twist, redirect, or escalate. There is a quiet contradiction here that most people never stop to examine. The more you try to fix the situation through direct engagement, the more the situation seems to grow. You explain once, and it turns into a longer discussion. You defend yourself, and it turns into an argument. You try to clarify, and suddenly the focus shifts away from the original issue into something else entirely. It feels like progress at first because you are doing something, you are speaking, you are reacting, you are involved. But beneath that surface, the pattern stays the same. The other person is still in control of the pace, still deciding when to push, when to provoke, when to step back, and when to start again. And you are left reacting to each move, trying to keep up, trying to manage the situation with more effort each time. This is the moment where the pattern needs to be interrupted, not with more words, not with louder boundaries, but with a completely different kind of response that feels almost too simple to work. Instead of stepping forward, you step back. Instead of engaging, you reduce your presence in the interaction. Instead of feeding the cycle with energy, you slowly remove that energy piece by piece. At first, this feels unnatural because everything you have learned pushes you toward action, toward response, toward expression. Staying quiet, staying neutral, staying emotionally detached feels like you are giving something up, but in reality, you are taking something back that has been used against you without you noticing. Toxic behavior depends on a very specific dynamic. It needs movement, it needs reaction, it needs engagement to survive. Without these elements, it begins to weaken, not instantly, but gradually in a way that becomes more visible over time. This is why the usual advice, while useful in other situations, often fails here. It keeps the dynamic active. It keeps the loop going. It gives the other person exactly what they need to continue. And the more skilled they are at this behavior, the better they become at using your responses to maintain control of the interaction. When you stop playing your part in that pattern, something shifts. The expected response does not come. The reaction they are waiting for does not appear. The conversation does not follow the usual path. At first, this creates confusion. Then it creates pressure, because they may try harder to get the reaction back. The tone may change, the words may become sharper, the attempts may become more direct. This is the stage where many people think the approach is not working because the behavior seems to intensify. But this is not failure, this is a sign that the pattern is being disrupted. The system is trying to restore itself, to bring you back into the role you used to play. If you remain consistent in this quieter approach, if you continue to reduce your emotional responses, if you stop providing the energy that used to keep the interaction alive, the dynamic begins to collapse slowly. There is nothing to build on, nothing to escalate, nothing to twist into something else. Without reaction, there is no reward. Without reward, the behavior loses its purpose. And over time, the intensity decreases, the attempts become less frequent, and eventually the person may shift their attention elsewhere where they can get the response they are looking for. This does not require you to say anything dramatic or to make a clear announcement about what you are doing. In fact, the less you explain this shift, the more effective it becomes. Because the moment you try to explain it, you are once again engaging, once again providing material, once again stepping back into the pattern. The power of this approach comes from its simplicity and its consistency. It is not about proving a point, it is not about winning an argument, it is about quietly stepping out of a cycle that depends on your participation. In this video, you will learn how to apply this approach in a way that feels natural and controlled, without creating unnecessary tension or drawing attention to the change. You will learn how to make toxic people lose interest in you without saying a word, not by ignoring reality, but by understanding how their behavior operates and choosing not to feed it. You will see how small adjustments in your reactions can create a noticeable shift in how others interact with you. You will understand why silence, when used correctly, is not passive. It is an active decision that changes the direction of the entire interaction. There is no need for drama in this process. No need for long explanations. No need for repeated arguments. No need for emotional exhaustion. The goal is not to defeat the other person, but to remove yourself from the system that gives them influence over you. And when that influence disappears, the behavior has nothing to attach itself to. This is where real control begins, not in forcing outcomes, but in choosing where your energy goes and where it stops. The idea of silent control may sound simple, but its impact is deep because it changes the foundation of how interactions unfold. Instead of reacting to every move, you become selective. Instead of being pulled into every conversation, you create space. Instead of trying to manage the other person, you manage your own responses. And this shift, while subtle, creates a boundary that does not need to be announced or defended. It exists through your actions, through your consistency, through your refusal to engage in patterns that no longer serve you. As you continue watching, each part of this approach will become clearer, more practical, and easier to apply in real situations. The focus is not on theory, but on understanding the mechanics behind toxic behavior and using that understanding to your advantage in a calm and controlled way. By the end, the idea of dealing with toxic people without saying a word will no longer feel unrealistic or passive. It will feel like a direct and effective strategy that removes stress instead of creating more of it. A strategy that protects your energy instead of draining it, and a strategy that works quietly in the background while everything else begins to settle on its own. There is a quiet pattern that keeps repeating, and it feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain but easy to recognize once it starts. You say something simple, something clear, and somehow it comes back to you in a different form, twisted just enough to change the meaning. You try to correct it, but that correction turns into another misunderstanding. You explain again, this time more carefully, and now the focus shifts completely. What started as a small point becomes a long exchange that goes nowhere. Words are taken out of context, small details are turned into big issues, and before you even notice, you are no longer talking about the original topic. You are defending yourself, trying to bring the conversation back, trying to make sense of something that keeps slipping out of your control. The more you try to fix it, the more complicated it becomes, and the more it feels like you are losing ground even when you know you are right. There is also a subtle push that keeps pulling you in even when you decide to stay calm. A comment that feels slightly off, a tone that carries just enough tension, a question that sounds simple but hides something underneath. You notice it, you feel it, and even if you try to ignore it, it stays in your mind. You respond carefully, choosing your words with more attention, trying to avoid any escalation. But the response you get pulls you deeper. It adds another layer, another small shift, another reason to reply again. You try to stay balanced, but the interaction slowly builds pressure. It does not explode immediately. It stretches, it lingers, it keeps you engaged longer than you intended. And by the time it ends, it does not feel finished, it feels unfinished in a way that follows you even after the conversation is over. Energy begins to drain in a way that is not always obvious in the moment. It shows up later, when you are alone, when your mind starts replaying everything that was said. You go over the conversation again, looking for the point where it changed, trying to understand how it moved away from what you meant. You think about what you could have said differently, how you could have responded in a better way, how you could have stopped it earlier. The thoughts loop again and again, each time slightly different, each time searching for a version where the outcome feels better. But the more you think about it, the more it stays with you, and the harder it becomes to let it go. It is not just the words, it is the feeling that comes with them. The sense that something was off, something was not fair, something was not clear. You try to stay calm in the next interaction, telling yourself that this time will be different. You prepare mentally, you decide not to react, not to get pulled in, not to let it affect you the same way. But the pattern starts again, sometimes in a slightly different form, sometimes with new words, but with the same underlying dynamic. A small trigger appears, a slight shift in tone, a question that leads somewhere unexpected, and suddenly you are back in the same position. You respond even if only a little, and that response becomes the starting point for the next exchange. You try to stay in control, but the situation slowly moves in a direction you did not choose, and once again you end up feeling worse than when it started. This cycle is not random, and it is not happening because you are doing something wrong in a simple sense. It follows a pattern that depends on something very specific, something that is easy to miss because it feels natural to give it. Every reaction you provide, every emotional response, every attempt to explain or defend becomes part of a system that keeps the interaction alive. It is not about the topic, it is about the reaction. It is not about solving the issue, it is about maintaining the engagement. Toxic people do not want solutions in the way most conversations aim for. They are not looking for clarity. They are not trying to reach a balanced outcome. They are looking for a response, something they can use, something they can build on, something that keeps the exchange going. Attention becomes a kind of fuel in this dynamic. The more attention you give, the more energy flows into the interaction. It does not matter if the attention is positive or negative, calm or emotional, long or short. What matters is that it exists. Each response adds another layer, another opportunity, another reason for the conversation to continue. This is why even well-intended responses can keep the cycle alive. You try to be calm, you try to be clear, you try to be reasonable, but as long as the attention is there, the system has what it needs to keep going. And the moment that attention is reduced, something begins to change in a way that is not always immediate but becomes clear over time. When you stop feeding the pattern, when the reactions become smaller, when the emotional energy is no longer available, the dynamic begins to shift. At first, it may not look like a change. In fact, it may look like the opposite. The attempts to pull you in may increase. The tone may become sharper, the comments more direct, the pressure slightly stronger. This is a response to the missing fuel. The system is trying to restore what it lost. But if the fuel does not return, if the reactions remain limited, if the attention stays controlled, the pattern starts to weaken. It has nothing to build on, nothing to expand, nothing to keep it moving in the same way. This is where the first real shift begins, not in the other person, but in your approach. Emotional detachment is not about becoming cold or distant in a way that affects everything in your life. It is a focused adjustment in specific interactions where the pattern is clear. It means that when something is thrown at you, it does not land in the same way. The words reach you, but they do not trigger the same internal response. The urge to reply is there, but it is not acted on immediately. There is a pause, a space between what is said and how you respond. In that space, the usual reaction loses its automatic power. You are still aware, still present, but not pulled into the same emotional flow. This kind of detachment feels unusual at first because it goes against the habit of responding quickly, of explaining immediately, of correcting what feels wrong. But with time, it becomes more natural. You begin to notice the difference between reacting and choosing a response. You see how certain comments are designed to create a reaction, and once you see that clearly, it becomes easier not to follow that path. The interaction loses its intensity because the emotional layer is no longer active in the same way. And without that layer, many of the usual patterns cannot continue as before. Silence plays a powerful role in this shift, not as a passive absence of words, but as an active decision not to engage in the usual way. When there is no reply, no immediate response, no visible reaction, it creates a break in the pattern. The expected sequence does not happen. The other person sends something out, but nothing comes back in the form they are used to. This can feel uncomfortable at first, both for you and for them, because it changes the rhythm of the interaction, but that discomfort is part of the shift. It signals that the usual flow has been interrupted. Silence removes the reward that often comes from a reaction. Without a response, there is no reinforcement. The attempt does not lead to the usual outcome, and over time, this reduces the motivation to continue in the same way. It is not about ignoring everything completely, but about choosing when to respond and when not to, based on whether the interaction is constructive or simply part of the pattern. This selective silence creates a boundary that does not need to be explained. It is understood through repetition, through consistency, through the absence of the expected reaction. Another layer of this approach is reducing the energy in the responses that do happen. Not every situation allows complete silence, and sometimes a response is necessary. In those moments, the goal is not to engage with full emotional intensity, but to keep the response simple, neutral, and limited. Short answers, clear statements, no extra explanation, no emotional tone that can be used to extend the interaction. This changes the quality of the exchange. It becomes less interesting for the other person, less engaging, less rewarding. When the energy is low, when the responses are minimal, the interaction does not provide the same level of stimulation. There is nothing to build on, nothing to escalate, nothing to turn into a longer exchange. It becomes flat in a way that makes it difficult to continue the pattern. Over time, this reduces the frequency and intensity of the attempts to engage in the same way. The dynamic loses its appeal because it no longer produces the same results. This approach requires consistency, because a single change is not enough to shift a pattern that has been repeated many times. One strong reaction can restart the cycle, bringing back the same dynamic that was beginning to weaken. This is why discipline is important, not in a rigid or stressful way, but in a steady and aware manner. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce the new approach, to maintain the boundary, to keep the energy controlled. Consistency builds a new pattern, one where the expected reactions are no longer present. Over time, this becomes the new normal. The other person begins to adjust, not necessarily by changing their behavior completely, but by recognizing that the usual methods no longer work in the same way. The attempts may decrease, the intensity may drop, and the focus may shift elsewhere. This does not happen instantly, and it does not happen in a straight line. There may be moments where the pressure increases, where the attempts become stronger, where the pattern tries to return to its previous form. But with consistent responses, these moments pass, and the overall direction continues to move toward less engagement. As this process continues, a noticeable change begins to appear. The interactions become shorter, less frequent, less intense. The need to respond decreases, the urge to explain fades, the mental replay after the conversation becomes less strong. The space that was once filled with repeated thoughts and emotional reactions begins to open. There is more clarity, more calm, more control over where your attention goes. At a certain point, the dynamic reaches a stage where the other person no longer finds the interaction rewarding in the same way. The attempts to engage may stop, or they may become so minimal that they no longer have a significant impact. This is not because they were convinced by an argument or changed by a discussion. It is because the conditions that supported the behavior are no longer present. The fuel is gone, and without it, the pattern cannot continue. The deeper shift in all of this is not just in how the other person behaves, but in how you experience the situation. You are no longer reacting automatically, no longer pulled into every exchange, no longer carrying the same level of emotional weight after each interaction. The sense of control changes, not because you are controlling the other person, but because you are controlling your own responses in a consistent and aware way. This is not avoidance in the usual sense. It is not about pretending the situation does not exist or refusing to deal with it at all. It is about changing the way you engage so that the interaction no longer affects you in the same way. It is about removing the parts of the exchange that create stress and keeping only what is necessary. This creates a form of distance that is not physical but behavioral and emotional. In this space, the need to prove a point becomes less important. The need to win an argument fades. The focus shifts from changing the other person to maintaining your own balance. And in that shift, the entire dynamic changes. The power that once came from provoking reactions loses its effect. The control that depended on your engagement begins to disappear. The result is not dramatic in a visible way, but it is clear in how it feels. The interactions no longer carry the same weight. The conversations do not linger in your mind in the same way. The emotional impact decreases. And the sense of being pulled into something against your will is replaced by a sense of choice, of control, of calm that remains even when the situation appears similar on the surface. This is where the real shift becomes visible, not in a single moment, not in a clear victory, but in a gradual change that affects every part of the interaction. You did not fight harder, you did not speak louder, you did not prove more. You changed the way you responded, and in doing so, you changed the outcome without needing to control anything outside of yourself. So in the end, nothing dramatic was required, no perfect speech, no final argument, no moment where you finally said everything the right way. The shift happened quietly, almost in a way that others could not even point out clearly. Because the real change was not in what you said, it was in what you stopped giving. The reactions slowed down, the explanations became shorter, the emotional pull lost its grip, and without that constant flow of energy, the entire pattern began to fade on its own. So no, you didn't need to say anything. You just stopped playing the game. You stepped out of a cycle that depended on your participation, and once you were no longer feeding it, it could not continue in the same way. That is where real control lives, not in forcing outcomes, but in choosing where your attention goes and where it ends. And when you look at it from this place, it becomes clear that silence is not empty. It is a decision. It is awareness in action. It is the ability to see what is happening without being pulled into it. You did not lose your voice, you simply chose not to use it where it would be wasted. You did not avoid the situation, you changed your role in it. And that small shift creates a space where peace can exist without needing constant defense, because not every situation deserves your words, and not every person deserves your energy. If this felt personal, if parts of this sounded familiar in a way that stayed with you, then understand this clearly: you are not alone in this. Many people go through the same patterns without ever realizing there is another way to handle them. And the moment you see it, the moment you understand it, you already begin to move differently. Stay connected with this space if you want more ideas that help you protect your energy and move through situations with more clarity and control. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs peace, not more arguments. Someone who is tired of repeating the same exhausting cycles and is ready for a quieter, stronger way forward.